Day my aunt handed me that envelope, she was smiling. Not the warm kind. The kind people wear when they've already decided how the story ends. I had been living in my grandmother's house for 2 years by then. Not because I had nowhere else to go. I had an apartment across town, a lease I was still paying on, a life I had quietly set aside. I moved in because my grandmother was sick and no one else was going to do it. She had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's when I was 26. My mother was gone by then. She passed when I was 19. So the family that remained was my aunt, her husband, their son, and a handful of cousins who showed up at Thanksgiving and called that enough. My grandmother had one daughter left, and that daughter, my aunt, lived 40 minutes away, and apparently that was too far. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I did not move in expecting anything. I did not sit down with a calendar and calculate what I might eventually inherit. I moved in because she was alone and scared and she kept leaving the stove on. I moved in because she called me one night at 11 and couldn't remember where she kept her medication, and I drove over and found her sitting on the kitchen floor, not hurt, just confused, and I thought, I cannot leave her like this. So I didn't. Her name was Frances. Everyone called her Fran. She was 79 and sharp as anything on her good days, and on her bad days, she was still funnier than most people I've known. She liked game shows and strong coffee and had very firm opinions about which grocery store had the best rotisserie chicken. She was not a woman you pitied. She was a woman you paid attention to. My aunt's name is Patrice. Her husband is Gerald. Their son is Trevor. I mention all three because all three matter to what comes later. For the first year, it was just Grandma Fran and me. I rearranged my work schedule so I could freelance from the house. I drove her to her neurologist appointments. I organized her medications into one of those weekly pill organizers she initially refused to use because she said it made her feel like a patient. I put her electric blanket on before she went to bed so it was warm when she climbed in. These are small things, but small things add up, and the absence of small things adds up faster. My aunt called about once a month. She would ask how Grandma Fran was doing. I would tell her. She would say, "That's so good that you're there." And then she would talk about Trevor's new job or Gerald's golf handicap for 20 minutes and hang up. She came in person 3 times that year, once at Christmas, once when Grandma Fran had a fall. She didn't break anything, but it scared us. And once in October when she drove out specifically to look at a painting in the living room that she wanted to know if Grandma Fran was doing anything with. The painting was a landscape that had hung there since before I was born. My grandmother told her it was staying on the wall. My aunt smiled and said, "Of course, of course." Grandma Fran got worse in the second year. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was more like watching something slowly blur. She had more bad mornings. She started having trouble with words sometimes, reaching for one and landing on another. Her neurologist added a medication, adjusted another. I went to every appointment and took notes on my phone. I learned more about dopamine pathways than I ever expected to. One afternoon, she asked me to sit down with her at the kitchen table. She had a folder in front of her. I remember the folder was yellow, the kind with the little brass clasp, and it looked like something from an office supply store in 1987. She had clearly been holding on to it for a long time. She said, "I need to tell you something before I lose the words for it." That sentence hit me somewhere I wasn't expecting. I sat down. She explained that 2 years before her diagnosis, when she was still fully herself and living alone and healthy, she had worked with an attorney to update her estate documents. She had a will, which I knew about in the vague way you know things you don't want to think about. But she also had something else. She had set up a revocable living trust. She told me the house was in the trust, her savings account was in the trust. The trust named me as the successor trustee upon her incapacitation or death. I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "I know this is a lot." I said, "Grandma, I didn't ask for this." She said, "I know, that's exactly why." She explained it carefully, the way she explained everything, methodically, without drama. Her daughter, my Aunt Patrice, would receive a cash distribution. It was a meaningful amount. It was not nothing. But the house and the bulk of the estate would be managed by me, with instructions for how the assets were to be handled and eventually distributed. The attorney who had drafted everything was a man named Mr. Okafor, and his number was in the folder. The documents had been notarized and filed properly, everything was in order. I told her I needed to read it before I said anything else. She pushed the folder across the table and said, "Take your time." I read it that night after she went to bed. Then I called Mr. Okafor the next morning, and he walked me through it. It was exactly as she had described, completely legitimate, witnessed and notarized by people who were not related to either of us, signed when she had been assessed as fully competent. He told me it had been drafted during a period when she had become worried about what might happen to her home if things got complicated with the family. He did not say more than that. He didn't need to. I put the folder in a fireproof lockbox I bought that same week. I did not tell my aunt. Here's the part where I should explain that I knew something was coming. I didn't know the specifics. But I had noticed the frequency of my aunt's calls increasing around month 14. I noticed that she started asking more questions about Grandma Fran's finances. How are her accounts? Is she still with the same bank? Did she ever change her beneficiaries after Grandpa passed? Small questions, slipped in casually, like she was just making conversation. I answered vaguely. I said I didn't really know the details. I let her think I was a caretaker, not someone who had been given legal authority. I want to be honest, part of me felt guilty about that. Not guilty enough to tell her, but guilty enough to notice the feeling. Grandma Fran had a harder month in February. She had a minor infection that knocked her back significantly, the kind that hits elderly people differently than it hits everyone else. She was in and out of the hospital for about 10 days. I was there every day. I stayed overnight twice. My aunt visited once. She brought a poinsettia, even though it was February, which I think means she grabbed it from her car where it had been sitting since Christmas. The morning Grandma Fran came home from the hospital, Patrice called me and said she thought it might be time to reassess the situation. I asked what she meant. She said the house was a lot to manage for someone my age, and maybe it made more sense for a family member with more stability. She did not say my name, she said a family member to take over management of things. She said she had talked to Gerald about it and they were prepared to step in. I said I would think about it. 2 weeks later, she arrived at the house unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. Gerald was with her. Trevor pulled up in a separate car 10 minutes later. My grandmother was napping. Patrice sat down across from me at the same kitchen table where my grandmother and I had sat with the yellow folder, and she told me that she had spoken to an attorney. She said the attorney had advised her that as my grandmother's daughter and closest living adult relative, she had grounds to petition for guardianship. She said that she had documentation of concerns about my grandmother's cognitive capacity. I asked her what documentation. She mentioned the hospital stay, the Parkinson's diagnosis, some notes she'd apparently been keeping. She said it would be better for everyone if I stepped aside voluntarily. Gerald nodded along. Trevor was looking at his phone. She said, "You've done a wonderful job here, truly. But this is a family matter. I want to tell you that I said something sharp and memorable in that moment. I didn't. I said, 'I hear you,' and I asked her to give me a few days to process." She looked at me with that smile again, the decided one. After they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I called Mr. Okafor. He told me what I already suspected, that a guardianship petition would be complicated by the existence of the trust, by my grandmother's existing advance directives, and by the fact that she had clearly expressed her wishes in legally binding documents while competent. He said to document everything going forward. He said to keep my grandmother's neurologist in the loop. He said not to panic. I am not a person who panics, but I will admit that I sat on the floor of the laundry room that night and cried for about 15 minutes. Not out of fear exactly. Out of grief, I think. Grief that this was happening at all. That while I had been cutting my grandmother's pills in half when she had trouble swallowing them whole, while I had been learning the difference between on-time medications and off-time in Parkinson's care, while I had been doing this quietly and without asking for recognition, someone had been building a case against me. I told my grandmother about it the next morning. I thought about not telling her, but she was sharper that day, and she deserved to know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That folder I gave you, you still have it?" I said yes. She said, "Good." The guardianship petition was filed the following month. My aunt's attorney argued that my grandmother's cognitive decline made her vulnerable, and that her existing arrangements needed court review. It sounded reasonable on paper. These things often do. Grandma Fran's neurologist submitted a written statement. It said that while her condition was progressive, she had demonstrated consistent understanding of her personal circumstances, had expressed clear preferences about her care, and showed no signs of the kind of acute impairment that would suggest her prior legal decisions should be invalidated. He had been her doctor for 3 years. He knew her. Mr. Okafor filed the trust documentation with the court. He walked through the timeline carefully. When it had been created, who had witnessed it, what assessments had been done at the time. He requested and received the notes from the notary, who had been present. Everything was traceable, clear, dated. The hearing was in April. My grandmother did not have to testify, but she wanted to attend. She wore a blue cardigan she had owned for years and sat in the gallery and looked completely like herself. The judge reviewed the petition and the existing documentation. Patrice's attorney argued that the trust should be set aside and guardianship granted on the basis of cognitive vulnerability. Mr. Okafor argued that there was no basis for this given the documented timeline and medical record. The judge asked Patrice's attorney a direct question. What specific evidence existed that my grandmother had been under undue influence or lacked capacity at the time the trust was created? The attorney cited the Parkinson's diagnosis. The judge noted that the diagnosis had come 2 years after the trust was drafted. The attorney mentioned the hospital stay. The judge noted that a respiratory infection did not retroactively affect decisions made years earlier. There was a long pause. The petition was denied. I did not look at my aunt when the decision came through. I looked at my grandmother. She was looking straight ahead. After a moment, she reached over and put her hand on mine, and that was it. Outside the courthouse, my aunt tried to speak to me. She said I had made things very difficult for this family. She said she hoped I understood what I had done. Gerald stood next to her with his arms crossed. Trevor had not come. I said, I hope you find some peace with it. She said I was being condescending. Maybe I was, I don't know. I was tired. The drive home was quiet. Grandma Fran had the window down even though it wasn't quite warm enough for that yet, and she had her head tipped slightly toward the air the way she does when she's thinking. About 20 minutes from home, she said, without looking at me. She was always like this. Even when she was little, she wanted whatever someone else had. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, I'm sorry. She said, don't be. You didn't make her that way. We don't talk about it much now. My aunt has not reached out since April. Trevor sent a text message 3 weeks after the hearing that said no hard feelings with the thumbs up emoji, which I found so confusing I didn't reply. Grandma Fran is home. She is still herself most days. Some days are harder. We adjusted the kitchen layout so it's easier for her to navigate on mornings when her hands aren't cooperating. Her neurologist added a new therapy a few months ago that she says is helping. She has strong opinions about which pharmacy has faster service, and she will argue this point with anyone who will listen. Last week, she watched her game shows and fell asleep in her chair, and I covered her with a blanket and went back to the table to work. The house was quiet in the way it gets in the late afternoon, that particular low gold light coming through the front windows. I have thought a lot since everything happened about what my aunt actually believed. I don't think she is purely malicious. I think she saw something valuable and told herself a story about how it should belong to her, and told that story long enough that it felt true. People do that. Families do that. There's something about property and inheritance that makes people into different versions of themselves, sometimes worse versions, and I think she simply let herself become that version and didn't notice how far she had gone. I'm not interested in punishing her for it. I'm not interested in her at all, honestly. I have enough to think about. What I think about instead is my grandmother at that kitchen table, sliding a yellow folder toward me with both hands, saying she needed to tell me something before she lost the words for it, that she had thought ahead, that she had, in her quiet and practical way, made sure that someone she trusted would be standing on solid ground when the time came. She didn't do it to win anything. She did it because she loved someone and wanted that love to have weight in the world, to actually mean something when it mattered. I think about that a lot. There's a thing that happens when you take care of someone. A real kind of care, the kind that costs you time and sleep and the plans you had for yourself. where you stop thinking about what you're getting out of it. You're just in it. You're just there. And the people who observe that from the outside sometimes mistake the stillness of it for passivity. They think that because you're not demanding anything, you have no position. They think silence is the same as having nothing. It isn't. The people who love quietly are not the ones without resources. They're usually the ones who thought ahead. I have thought a lot about cause and effect since everything settled. Not in a mystical way, just the plain, observable kind. The kind where you watch a set of choices play out over years and eventually you can trace a clear line from decision to consequence. No mystery required. My aunt spent a long time building a version of events in which she was the logical heir. She did not do the work, but she told herself the work wasn't what mattered. She told herself proximity to blood was enough. And maybe in another family, in another set of circumstances, that story would have held. But she was building it on top of something she hadn't accounted for. The fact that Grandma Fran had already thought further ahead than any of us knew. The fact that while my aunt was deciding the house was hers, my grandmother was sitting with an attorney making sure that love had a legal spine. That is what I keep coming back to. Not revenge. Not winning. Just the weight of a decision made carefully and quietly, years before it was needed. Grandma Fran did not act out of anger. She acted out of clarity. She saw what her family was capable of. Not with bitterness, she told me once. It wasn't bitterness, and she did something about it. That is the kind of intelligence I want to carry with me. The kind that doesn't wait for a crisis to get organized. There's something I learned about integrity from all of this that I couldn't have articulated before it happened. Integrity is not just about doing the right thing when people are watching. It's about doing it when no one is, for so long and so consistently that it becomes structural. It becomes the foundation people either stand on or fall through. I showed up for Grandma Fran because she needed someone to show up. I didn't do it to position myself or to earn anything. But those choices accumulated. They became a record. And when the moment came where someone tried to rewrite that record, the truth was already documented in a way that couldn't be argued away. My aunt made different choices. She chose absence when presence was needed and presence when it was self-serving. And I do not say that to condemn her. I say it because choices like that have a way of closing doors you didn't realize you were closing. By the time she tried to assert her claim, she had already forfeited the credibility that might have given her one. That is not punishment from some outside force. That is just what happens when actions and consequences finally catch up with each other in the same room. What I want to hold on to from this is not the outcome. It is the steadiness that got me there. The decision over and over again to do the next right thing without making a show of it. To stay when leaving would have been easier. To keep the folder safe and say nothing and trust that the truth would be enough when it needed to be. It was enough. It usually is if you're patient and you're honest and you don't let someone else's urgency become your own. Grandma Fran is still here. Some mornings are harder than others. But she is here, in her house, in her chair, watching her game shows with opinions about the contestants that she will share whether or not you asked. That is what all of it was for. Not the legal victory. Not being right. Just her, still in her own home, still herself. That is more than enough.